Welcome, everyone. We are so excited to have you here for our Jewish virtual tour of Cuba. And I will introduce our special guests in just a minute. So you may be here in the Zoom room, you may be watching on YouTube, so some technical notes. There will be time for questions towards the end of the presentation. And you can put those questions in the chat box, and we'll be looking at the chat box as we go. And I think that's all. If you have any technical issues, you can send a chat to me. My name's Julie. Again, welcome to My Jewish Learning. And I want to give a warm welcome to everyone who's here, and to introduce our guest, Saul Berenthal. Saul, can you unmute yourself and say hello, and then I'll introduce you?
I just did. Hi, everybody.
Hi. So this is Saul Berenthal. He was born in Havana in 1944, where his parents found refuge after fleeing Europe. They fled again to Miami in 1960 following the 1959 Castro Revolution. And Saul started going back to Cuba about a dozen years ago, taking an interest in revisiting his former homeland. And now Saul and his family own and operate a travel agency and Cuba's first and only kosher boutique hotel, the Chateau Blanc. And I will put links to both of those in the chat if you want to explore and learn more about either of those later. And their hope is to bring by bringing travelers, that they can expose the world to what Cuba has to offer. So we are very excited to hear a little bit more about the history of Jewish Cuba. And thank you so much for being here and joining us today at My Jewish Learning, Saul. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you. Let me put the chart up and we'll start talking. So I'm neither an academic nor a historian. So what qualifies me to come here and talk about Jewish Cuba? Well, I'll tell you, I've read a lot of books. I listened to a lot of historians, but I have experienced Cuba firsthand before the revolution, during the revolution, after the revolution, and then coming back after the change of policy of the US towards Cuba. I am what you call a repatriated Cuban. Being repatriated means that I became a citizen again, and I became a resident again. And therefore, I am allowed to be a Cuban that can be in business in Cuba. And I think that that's what makes it. Me and my family, all of us are Cuban citizens, repatriated to Cuba, and we run a business there. I wanted to do all this because I wanted to get firsthand experience in today's Cuba as to what the economic framework is, what the policies are, what the politics are, and be able to really understand what is happening, the relationship between Cuba, the US, and most important than everything else, the Cuban Jews that are still left in Cuba. So we're going to be talking about that. Cuba is the big island in the Caribbean. You see a few statistics there, but one of the things that I like to point out is that about 20% of the Cuban population lives outside Cuba, much of it in southern Florida. Most of them have relatively friends in Cuba. So there's a lot of exchange of information, trips, etc., between the Cuban Americans and the Cuban Cubans. That has come up in the politics of nowadays and has had some influence on policy between the US and Cuba. To talk about Cuba is to be able to go back to beginnings, and we'll talk about a little bit more about the beginnings, but sufficient to say that Havana just 2 years ago celebrated the 500th anniversary of its foundation. So think about Havana being a capital before the US was a country. That's the type of culture that you will see exists in Cuba. I also like to talk about Cuba in terms of what it is. And to give you an example of it, I had an occasion to visit Cuba with the Secretary of Commerce of North Carolina recently. And one of the comments that he made that made an impact on me, and he said after our trip, even though Cuba is in the Caribbean, Cuba is not an island. Cuba is a country. So it gives you a little bit of a view of how Cuba believes it is and how the people around the world view of Cuba. Now, I want to go and talk a little about the Jewish impact throughout history in Cuba. And of course, we're going to be touching everything from the beginning, Columbus discovering Cuba, all the way to today's Cuba and the Jewish environment in Cuba. So let's talk a little bit about the first Jews that ever arrived in Cuba. First Jews that ever arrived in Cuba came with Christopher Columbus. Why did they come with Columbus? Is because Columbus made his first trip during the Inquisition in Spain. The Inquisition had made all the Jews of Spain and parts of Portugal to either convert to Catholicism or go to jail. So there were two types of Jews that existed at the time in Spain, from the point of view of Spain. The conversos, those who said that they had converted to Christianity, Catholicism. Some of them meant it, some of them didn't, but said they did. And then there were the marranos, those who did not or did not want to confess that they were not going to convert. And marranos is another word for pig in Spanish. So you can understand a little bit of how they were being considered at the time. And in essence, why did they go with Columbus in his trip? Was because Spain gave him a chance of either staying in jail or taking this adventure. And some of them did take the adventure and came with Columbus at the time. The other thing that I'd like to point out is that most people think or have read somewhere in history that the Columbus trip was financed by Queen Isabella's selling her jewels to be able to pay for the expenses. Fake news. That was not the case. It was really Jews from Portugal that financed the trip. People with the name of Arabanel, Santangel, Sanchez, which are Jewish names, but have become very much common names in many of the Latin American countries. Those are Jewish names. Many of them were conversos, are today Catholics, Christians, etc., but do have a lot of roots back into Judaism. Perez and Rodriguez, which are very, very Spanish names, are also of Jewish origin. So let's talk about what the Spaniards did in Cuba when they first came. The first thing that they did in Cuba was start using the Indians, the natives, as slaves. They decimated the whole Indian population in Cuba. That's where they had to bring Black slaves from Africa, and that's how Cuba became a hub for the transfer of Black slaves into many parts of America, but very especially to the US. You may recall a movie, a very famous movie by the name of Amistad. Amistad is a movie that relates a Spanish ship bringing African slaves from Cuba to the US and having a revolt inside it. If you want to look it up in Netflix, you will see a little bit of history of Cuba being the hub of slavery from Africa to the US. Now, let's talk a little bit about another aspect of Cuba. Cuba was under Spain for over 400 years. And somewhere along the line decided that they were going to have a war of independence with Spain. And Jose Marti, which I would call the equivalent of George Washington, was the one that inspired and went out of Cuba looking for financing to be able to finance the war against Spain. And guess what? Once again, it was the Jewish people, an American lawyer by the name of Harold Robbins, and two Romanian Jews, cousins, who became the fundraisers for the Cuban War of Independence against Spain. So this is another way of showing how Jews had an impact on the independence of Cuba from Spain, financially so. But further than that, as it went around during that war, the US took an interest on the war, and the War of Independence became what is known today as the Spanish-American War. And during this war, or after, shortly after the war, is when the first real colony of Jews was established in Cuba. It were the Jewish American soldiers that fought in the war that actually came back as carpetbaggers and established themselves in Cuba and started the first little colony congregation and built the first cemetery in Cuba. You can see the cemetery on the right bottom. And if you read it, it says in English, United Hebrew Congregation. So it was the American soldiers that came back, Jews, that established the first settlement of Jews in Cuba. Now, during that Spanish-American War, there was an incident called the blowing of the Maine. The Maine was a Navy ship from the US that, while parked in front of Havana, blew up and killed about 300 American sailors. And some people say that that was the reason that the US used to be able to come into the war and declare it a Spanish-American War. Something of interest that I didn't find out until I went back to Cuba was that during the revolution, there was this big monument to the Maine. And at the top of it, there was a big American eagle, the symbol of American power. After the revolution, Castro took it down and gave it back to the US. That eagle sits today in the house of the US ambassador to Cuba. And it is customary when you visit the ambassador to go to the back where the eagle sits and kind of stroke that eagle. It's an event of a lot of importance to Americans that do come to Cuba. So this is a picture of how the cemetery looks like inside. My wife, by the way, which is also Cuban, Cecilia, has taken it upon herself as doing a mitzvah of rebuilding the graves and the tombstones of the cemetery. So we do a lot of work, and she does a lot of work in terms of contacting people that we know, friend of ours, Cubans, Jubans, if you will, that have family in the cemetery. And we bring in pictures of how it looks, and we ask them if they want to refurbish it, do so, and then bring them back pictures of how it looks like now. We've done about 150 of those graves and have contributed a little bit to make it a better place for Jews to rest in Cuba. These are some pictures of groups that had been to the cemetery. I am one of those pictures with my rabbi saying Kaddish over the graves of my grandparents that are buried there. Now let's talk about the other two waves of Jews that came to Cuba. During the fall of the Ottoman Empire, of course, a lot of Sephardic Jews had to flee, and they ended up coming to Cuba. It was easy for them at the time because they spoke Ladino. Ladino is a type of old Spanish, if you will, Shakespearean English. is Ladino to Spanish. And they had the ability to communicate with Cubans, but they did not have, they were not used to living in big cities. So they pretty much abandoned Havana and moved to the other parts of the island where they had smaller cities and towns where they established themselves. The next wave that came to Cuba was a wave of Ashkenazi Jews. That's where my parents and my wife's parents came to Cuba. Ashkenazi Jews, of course, were fleeing from the war, the Second World War, and wanted to come to the States, but there were immigration issues, so to speak, quotas, etc., that did not allow the Jews to come to the United States. So the next best thing closest to the US was to go and establish themselves in Cuba. Cuba was a very welcoming country. It allowed them to come, it allowed them to work. They all became merchants, and that's where me and my family and my wife's family came to Cuba. They stayed in Cuba, they met each other, they married, and we were born, and had a very nice, easy, and entertaining life, so to speak. And you'll see a little bit about why it was so entertaining in a minute or two. One incident that should be pointed out is the St. Louis. St. Louis is a famous ship, was coming in from Europe, bringing in refugees, Jews refugees from the war to Cuba. There had been a deal that allowed them to come. Everybody was expected to get visas and disembark. But at the time, when they finally got there, the word came from the US that they shouldn't do that because they had too many people already waiting for quotas. Don't let them disembark. So it became a little bit of an embarrassing situation for the US, Cuba, etc. The St. Louis was sent back to Europe. And some people say that some of the Jews were able to escape to other parts. Some of the historians say that the Jews were all brought back to Germany and back into concentration camps. Don't know, but it was a very, very embarrassing moment for the countries as well as the Jews. So interesting, now getting a little bit closer to Cuba today, is that the first Communist Party in Cuba was formed in 1925, and guess what? Jews were a part of it. As a matter of fact, 3 of them needed interpreters to come in and become members because they didn't speak the language. But it was the Jews that introduced, or at least some of the Jews were part of the introduction of the Communist Party in Cuba. Some of those Jews and their descendants are still there and are part of the government, of the communist government in Cuba. I talk to them from time to time. So after 25, and now we're getting closer to when I was able to, when I was born. So I can tell you a little bit that I experienced. During the 40s and 50s, Cuba became a very popular place for Americans to come. And this is another area where our Jewish landsmen from the US were able to impact Cuba. Cuba became the largest or most important mafia setup for gambling. And who was in charge of it? People by the name of Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky, very famous mafia members that were in charge of the mafia in Cuba. This is important because it is this type of, I guess, abuse that you see in the history of Cuba that provoked the revolution. The abuses, the tyranny of the government, all the influence of the gambling, the drugs, etc., made the Cuban people very, very unsettled. And that's when Castro took advantage of the situation and started the revolution. So now we're going to go to another part of the presentation where, oh, I'm sorry. This is Casa de Al. Casa de Al is a restaurant that is supposed to be, I have not yet verified that to be the case, but Casa de Al is a restaurant that's supposed to have been Al Capone's house in Cuba. At least they say that's what it is. I'm not sure. Now, I talk about classic cars because classic cars is a very common thing between Cubans and Americans. For some reason, we all admire the American cars from the 50s. One of the most important things for any American that comes to Cuba is to be able to take a ride in one of those cars. It is a little bit personal to me because my father's business in Cuba was the importer of American automobile parts. So I kind of have a little bit of a good feeling for not only the business, but what those cars meant to the Cubans. Now we'll talk a little bit more about what happened during the collapse of the Soviet Union. Cuba was, after the revolution, was very dependent on Russia and the Eastern Bloc for their economy. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the economy of Cuba took a dive, more than 30% reduction in GDP, and literally Cuban people were starving. They were having problems, and Castro decided that it was time that they opened up Cuba and Cuba's economy to the world. In order to do that, they had to present as part of the civilized world, the world that accepts religion. Religion was, I would say, not forbidden, but not looked well upon during the revolution at the beginning, 60s, 70s, 80s. And most of the churches and synagogues were closed. Cuban people still follow their religion, but they did it in their houses, not as organized religion. The synagogues were closed, but when the economy collapsed and Cuba decided to open up to the world, they had to provide an image of acceptance of religion. They invited the Pope to come. The Pope allegedly convinced Castro to open up Cuba for religion, and everybody was happy, and a little bit of tourism started, which until the epidemic crisis of today, tourism was the major revenue flow to Cuba. So it was a circumstance that allowed freedom of religion to occur in Cuba. Now let's talk a little bit about me. I was born in 44. My parents and my wife's parents as well came from Europe. My mom was from Poland. My father was from Romania. My wife's mother was from Russia. His father was from Lithuania. So we're all in the mix of a little bit of everywhere. You see a couple of pictures in there. I'm the chubby guy on the left and in the middle on the left two pictures. This is the inauguration of the Library of the Patronato. That is the biggest Ashkenazi synagogue in Havana. On the right, you see my pictures leaving Cuba. And the package has cigar boxes, which is the thing that you bring to America when you leave Cuba so that you can sell them and have a little bit of money to take care of yourself until you settle down. I didn't want to stay in Miami, although we went to Miami. I didn't want to stay in Miami because I wanted to become an American. And if you stayed in Miami, you were going to stay a Cuban. To this day, Miami is still the heart of the Cuban population of the US. So I moved to New York, went to school, finished up in Long Island University, major in math and physics, and went to work for IBM. Worked for IBM for about 18 years, learned a lot, and decided to, well, first I decided to get married with my wife, which I knew from childhood. And after 18 years with IBM, I decided to leave IBM and start my own software business with a very good friend of mine who has been my business partner for many years, up to today. We founded, ran and sold 3 different software companies. And after the last one in 2008, I decided, well, it's about time to try to settle down a little bit and find out what happened to Cuba, because I never went back or thought about Cuba for 50 some odd years. And that's when in 2008, I went back to Cuba and started to learn about what was going on in Cuba. And interested in economics, I'm interested in business, I'm interested in understanding people, cultures, etc. So I decided the best way to do that, to learn about Cuba today, is to become a Cuban. And that's why we repatriated and became citizens and became residents and started a business. And therefore, I have firsthand look and feel for what's going on there, because we travel back and forth between the US and Cuba all the time. When President Obama changed policy towards Cuba, my partner and I decided to set up a project to go and present to Cuba. And that project was a tractor factory, assembly and production or fabrication of tractors. We were approved. We were the first US company ever approved in 50 years to start up a factory in Cuba. The Cubans looked at it and eventually decided that they were not interested in that happening. A lot of people have asked me the question, how can you go there, propose something noble like that, and then the Cuban government not accept it, especially since we were trying to become friends and the policy was changing between the US and Cuba. Well, it's complicated. Politics had a little bit to do with it, but commerce, more than anything, had a lot to do with it. Cuba as a country imports 80% of what they eat. And importing agricultural items to Cuba, chicken and all kinds of things that they eat, is cheaper than producing it in Cuba. That is a phenomena that occurs because in Cuba there are 2 currencies. There's the peso and the CUC, and because of the exchange rates between the 2, it has always been cheaper to bring imports than to produce in Cuba. That has changed because of the COVID environment. The ability for Cuba to import, in other words, no tourism, no money to buy things to import, they have now eliminated the 2 currencies, and it is now cheaper to produce than to import. So it is now the time that I believe that the tractor idea will be able to be reconsidered, and we may have a chance to be able to start that up again. But in the meantime, what we ended up doing is something that any Cuban can do. If you're a Cuban citizen and a resident in Cuba, is start a business. Start a business in terms of tourism, for example. And we started the Chateau Blanc, which is a hostel. And we wanted to be different. We wanted to be something that, number one, did not compete with the government. And number 2, something that would help bring Jews to Cuba. So the government would never be able to set up a hotel that would cater to Orthodox kosher Jews. To begin with, it have to be kosher. And the government doesn't know, doesn't understand, and will never be able to set up a hotel. So we have an ability to bring in a segment of the tourism market to Cuba that nobody else in Cuba could do. And therefore, we're not in competition with the government, which is a good thing. And second, it is something that allows Jews to come to Cuba. Yes, a lot of Jews come to Cuba, but the Orthodox that do not have kosher facilities really can't. So that's why we established the hostel as a kosher hostel. And it's been very successful until the pandemic. We were bringing 2 groups every month. Every group would stay in for a week or 10 days. And things were going very well. And the most important thing of it was that the Jewish community in Cuba was once again able to exchange with the Jewish community at large in the world, something that they have been neglected for many, many years. So the Jewish population in Cuba today, some people say 800, some people say 1,200, somewhere between 800 and 1,200. Most of them live in Havana. Me and many of my friends left during the revolution, so whatever is left right now is really a combination of the very few original Jews that stayed and converts into Judaism. The Cuban Jews are isolated, neglected, in need of support. We can make a difference. We can come and visit. We can bring them the ability to know that they are not alone, that we care for them. There are 3 synagogues in Havana. There are several others in small little towns. They're really not synagogues per se. They're houses that people live in, that the Jews that live in the area congregate to celebrate some of the holidays. From time to time, some Chabad people will come and help them celebrate, but it's not an official presence. There's not an official presence of Chabad in Cuba. So these are the pictures of the 3 synagogues. On the left, you see the synagogue. In the middle, you see the Orthodox synagogue. And to the right, you see the Patronato, or the conservative Ashkenazi synagogue. We were members of the Ashkenazi synagogue, but my mom's uncle was the president of the Orthodox synagogue. So God forbid I wouldn't have my bar mitzvah in the Orthodox synagogue. And I was the first bar mitzvah ever performed in the new Orthodox synagogue in Cuba. Talked a little bit about kosher in Cuba. In the good old times, there was kosher in Cuba. There was a Moshe Pipik restaurant. There was a Café Lili, which was a bakery. There was a deli and a butcher. There's even a butcher today. The cantor of the Orthodox synagogue considers himself a butcher. Whether he's recognized by the Orthodox community elsewhere, I don't know. But in Cuba, he is the kosher butcher. The government gives him some cattle from once in a while to be able to butcher and distribute to the Jewish population. So what we have done is bring in another kosher environment, but this time a little bit different. In our place, we don't have the old European style Jewish meals. In our place, we have Cuban food, kosher, prepared kosher. So people can come over and enjoy a different type of food, Cuban food, Latin food, but made. And that's one of the things that distinguishes from the old times. Here you see a little of the pictures of the things that we prepare. On the right, you have a fish paella. And on the left, you have a salad, the 2 kitchens, one milchiks and one fleischiks. And then all of the ingredients that we use, we bring from the US kosher. And we are certified as a kosher place. Now I'll show you some of the activities of some of the groups that come to Cuba. These are the things that they do. They visit the cemeteries, they visit the synagogues, they visit the whole Havana, go to the different places. Here is a Jew laying tefillin in the middle of Havana, and some of the sites that they come and visit all the time. This is a little bit of our dining room, bar, and terraces in the hostel that we run. And some of the activities, we go to the beaches, we go to salsa dancing, cigar rolling, arts. We visit the Hemingway hangouts, and we go to the special place where they grow the best tobacco leaves in Cuba, where the famous Cuban Habanos are made of. That is in the Valle of Vinales. A little bit of music, a little bit of art, a little bit of going ons that goes in Havana all the time. Havana is a city that opens up at night, and it goes until wee hours of the night every day, not only on weekends. So it's a very lively city to exist. Nowadays, because of the conditions of the pandemic, all these things have been reduced significantly. But we're all hoping that in time they will all come back. We also visit the important political areas there. You see Obama visiting the Plaza de la Revolución, which is where all the big gatherings during the revolution holidays are celebrated. It's kind of like Tiananmen Square for Cuba. A little bit of some of the museums that exist in Havana. This is the Revolution Museum, some of the art places that you can go and buy very, very good quality art in Cuba, cigar factories that we can visit, etc. So it's a series of activities that can happen in Havana and outside Havana, beaches, etc., that people go and enjoy. But our groups are mainly formed to come and participate in all these things, but visit with the Jewish community in Cuba. And I think I have not exceeded my time, but the presentation is over. Are we good?
We have questions.
Okay. So who's going to give me the questions?
I am.
Okay.
What is Cuba's relationship with Israel?
Okay. Believe it or not, there has been throughout all this time a lot of interactions between Israel and Cuba in the economic commercial area. Most of the citric industry in Cuba was built by Israelis that came to Cuba with government's permission and everything else to build that industry. The reason why Cuba and Israel do not, well, there are two reasons why Cuba and Israel do not have diplomatic ties. Number one, at the time, Fidel thought that he wanted to be the leader of the non-aligned nations of the world. And the number of Muslim countries that made up that organization was so big that Fidel could not be a friend of Israel and get the votes that he needed to become the leader of the non-committed. So he kind of set Israel aside, not to have relations with them, but did allow for commerce and economic exchanges with Israel. A lot of Israeli groups come to visit Cuba, believe it or not. The other part of it is that Israel government has always voted the UN aligned with the US position on the embargo. So when the US abstained on the embargo during Obama, Israel abstained. When the recent government voted in favor of the embargo, Israel voted in favor of the embargo. So politics, more than anything else, is what dictates the relationship. But underneath politics, there is a lot of activity with Israel.
Okay. What are the current rules for Americans to visit Cuba?
The current rules, and they have changed back and forth between Obama and Trump administrations, but the current rules are that as long as you don't stay in a Cuban hotel, meaning a hotel run by the government, whether it's military or any of the other enterprises of the government, and you do eat in private restaurants, you can go to Cuba. This is allegedly intended to punish the Cuban government because as an American, you're not allowed to stay in a Cuban-owned hotel unless it is privately owned, like our hostel is, or any other B&B in Cuba. They're private sector places, and restaurants that are also private sector bases. And it is intended to punish, but it really punishes the people. Because without tourism in Cuba, then the people who run all these private sector businesses do not survive very well.
Are there permanent rabbis at all three synagogues in Havana?
No, there's no rabbi in Cuba. The Orthodox synagogue cantor today used to call himself a rabbi, but he's no longer allowed to call himself a rabbi because he's not recognized, so he's the cantor. From time to time, there is an Argentinian rabbi that comes to Cuba, allegedly to perform weddings and brises and some of the Jewish religious holidays, but there is no permanent rabbi in Cuba nowadays.
Okay. Someone was there a few years ago, and they remember that the shelves of many of the stores, especially the drug stores, were virtually empty.
That is correct. Economy in Cuba is a very complicated environment. Depending on where and when you go to Cuba, there may be more or less goods available for the population. The Cuban socialist model of the economy is that the government is in charge of giving all the Cuban people a certain amount of rationed food in a job. And then based on the availability of food that they spread across all the Cuban people, there may be more or less, depending on the ability to produce goods in Cuba. Like I told you before, production in Cuba until now was not incentivized. They used to import 80% of what they eat. And most of it was imported for the tourism industry. So if you came to Cuba with hard currencies, dollars, euros, Canadian dollars, etc., you're able to go to stores where you can buy goods. But if you have to go to other stores where you pay with Cuban currency, then the assortment of goods is not as much as it may be in other stores.
Okay. Do you predict that Cuba will open again for tourism, and will relations with the U.S. improve?
Predictions. I've been predicting that for a long time. And I was right. I was right for a while, but then we changed our policy here. My prediction is that with the new government in the U.S., I think that Biden probably will not go all the way back to everything that Obama did, but will do significantly amount of changes so that Cuba's economy will be able to flourish a little bit more. However, I also believe that Cuba has to implement the changes that has promised that it will implement to be able to allow the private sector, Cuban private sector, to also grow. Being in business in Cuba, and being able to go back and forth, I'm very close to some of the activities that are going on with that. And without predicting too much, I can tell you that a lot of things are being done that will result in an improved way of doing business in Cuba.
And so they want to know what the current rules for Americans to visit Cuba are.
Well, number one, now you have to have a negative COVID test to be able to travel to Cuba. Number two, you can only travel to Havana. It's the only airport that is allowed for U.S. airlines to fly to Cuba. Number three, you got to stay at non-government hospitality, and you have to eat in private restaurants, which are called paladares. You can move around, you can go places, you can visit, you can go to the center, you can do everything else as long as you stay away from paying for hospitality and food that belongs to the Cuban government. That will probably be one of the first things that will disappear with the changes from the current administration, but we'll have to wait until that happens.
Okay. Do Jews wear jewelry like a Star of David or have mezuzahs openly? Tell their neighbors that they're Jewish?
Yes. Anti-Semitism in Cuba really never existed per se. Cuban Jews are not afraid nowadays of being Jews. Cuban Jews will wear mezuzahs, they will wear Star of David, etc. I used to, when I lived in Cuba as a kid, do that all the time, and nobody had a problem. I used to wear a kippah because I went to an Orthodox school. And I also wear a different kind of kippah when I went to military school, but that's a different story. So Jews were always open to practice their religion, except during that period where no religions were allowed in Cuba. But nowadays they go to the synagogues, they pray, they celebrate, they invite Cuban dignitaries to come to the synagogue. Sometimes they go.
Okay. Some Jews stayed and many left. What was the difference between the groups, and how do you respond to Cuban Jews who left under Castro and have very strong feelings about not returning?
What was the first part of the question?
The difference between the Jews that stayed and left.
The difference between, I'll tell you a little story about that. After my first trip, when I gathered myself and said, I want to go back and see what really is going on, I had a chance to have a sit down with Adela Dvorin. Some of you may have heard of her. Adela Dvorin is the president of the Ashkenazi synagogue, the Patronat, and she is the one that is the face of the Jewish community to the Communist Party. The relationship is not between the Jewish community or the religious community and the government. It is between the religious community and the Communist Party. And I and Ella knew each other from where we used to be young and live in Cuba. So we hadn't seen each other for many a days, for many a years, but we knew each other. And we had a little conversation. And that conversation, among many other things, the things that she said, you left us. And you left us here to suffer through all the things that we had to go through to stay being Jewish, while you went to the US and became who you are today. So we suffered a lot. And I heard that and I understood that. But then I asked her, do you remember your parents talking to you about running from Europe, coming to Cuba, establishing themselves in Cuba, working hard, learning a language, trying to understand the culture, and being able to grow in the country and have you as a daughter? That was not easy either. And we also suffered for having done what we did. We each made our choice. We each had to go through whatever it took to make us who we are. I'm proud of having become who I am because of what happened, and I hope that you are too. So the feelings of Cubans, Jewish Cubans, or many Cubans who left Cuba towards Cuba is something that I've thought about a lot. And the other little story that I can tell you about it is that many Cubans feel like the government took things from them. The government took over their businesses, they took over their houses, they made them go, the typical Jewish exodus. And I say to myself, well, this is not the first time it happens. In fact, to my parents, it happened twice. And that was really sad because they flew from Europe and established themselves in Cuba. And then they had to fly out of Cuba and establish themselves in the US. So they went through the process twice. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that you either hold on to that hate and you hold on to that feeling of being a victim, or you let go. And how you let go and why you let go, I'm going to give you a little example of it. As we started our businesses after we left IBM and started opening offices all over the world, one of the offices that I was going to open was going to be in Hamburg, Germany. So I remember coming to my father and asking him, look, we're expanding and we have to open an office in Germany. Would that be something that you would feel bad about. He said to me, so, okay. So they took away things from us and we feel bad about it. Is this an opportunity for you to go back and regain some of the stuff that we lost? Is this an opportunity for you to go to Germany and do business with Germany and benefit Germany as well as us from it? This is a thing what was taken away from you. By all means, this is the way to do it. This is the way to reconcile. This is the way to make sure that you don't have to feel bad about what happened. This is a way of growing up and going forward. That's the way I feel about it. I've talked to a lot of my friends that can now go beyond being a victim. And I tell them there are ways. You can think whatever you want, but the positive way is to not, but forgive and go forward. It happened during the wars. It happened during the Holocaust. It has happened many times in history. This is one more time, and this is the way to go forward.
Okay, last question. Is the Jewish community stable or growing, and are there many conversions to Judaism?
Yeah, there's a lot of conversion to Judaism for many reasons. One of the reasons is that the synagogue have a pharmacy where people that come to Cuba donate medicines, etc., and members have access to the medicine, etc. So there are some good reasons, economical reasons for belonging to it, but Cubans are spiritual and they do like to be a member of some spiritual congregation. Sometimes is Christian, sometimes is Santeria, which is one of the biggest religions in Cuba, and sometimes is Judaism. I know a lot of Cubans, friends of mine, that were born in Cuba and lived all their lives in Cuba and admire the Jewish religion and admire the way that Jews think about the world. I talked to them about Tikkun Olam, for example, and they're all excited about how can a religion have such a thinking that says you are giving a commandment to improve the world somehow every day. And they admired those type of things, and they do want to become part of the religion, sometimes through marriage, but sometimes all by themselves.
All right, that's it.
No more questions?
Okay, well, thank you so much, both to you, Saul, for this fascinating presentation, and also to Cindy on the back end, helping to field the questions. And I just want to let folks know who were asking. Yes, this has been recorded, and we will be sending you the link to the recording tomorrow. And we'll also include in that email information for how you can find out more about Saul and his family's hotel and their travel agency, and how to contact them should you wish to do so. So again, thank you for this wonderful, wonderful talk. And we're very honored to have hosted you. And thanks for everyone who joined.
Thank you for taking the time. An honor.
Bye.
Stay safe.